All right, let's get started, y'all. We're talking about three things today. And apologies for the asynchronous class on Friday, but there was a flood watch until 7 a.m. on Saturday. Of course, the weather would usually clear up in the afternoon. This is the sort of thing that always happens when one gives the morning off. That said, as you noted from your emails, and always be checking your emails, particularly between 8 and 5 on Tuesday to Friday. You saw that the class did in fact happen, but it happened at your leisure. There was a 28-minute or so lecture that I posted. Then actually, I think it was a pretty good lecture. And I will today, after I have gone over the prompts, talk a little bit about the essays, then given a new definition of modernism from our friend Beebe or Beebe from 1972, a few years after Levin. I will then try and very quickly go through chapters 9 through about 28, maybe 29. We are going to go from Marcella and Grisostomo to a much more complicated and compound sort of love square, talking about Don Fernando, Dorothea, Cardenio, Lucinda, and eventually we will talk about a wineskin too that is itself takes on the form of Don Quixote or of Don Fernando to Don Quixote at night and ends up costing the innkeeper Juan Palomeca yet again in his dealings with Don Quixote, and now his second dealing with Don Quixote. All right, let's talk about. I'm just going to very quickly go through this. But this is the Prelude Paper rubric and prompts. Note that this is due September 25th, which is about, I think, 17 days from now, about 2.5 weeks. So you should still be focusing on the reading as you continue to read. These prompts will make more and more sense to you. They will speak more and more to you. So, okay, 10 points received for reaching and remaining within the proper length. 3 pages, 12-point font, RL or Times New Roman, standard margins, which standard margins are included in Word if you use Word, and double spaced throughout, never quadruple spaced. If you're ever quadruple spacing anything, you have exited the bounds of the assignment. 10 points are received for including at least one in-text citation of a primary source. I give you some examples of how to do this with Cervantes. You have his name, no comma. People often want to do place commas, but in modern language association formatting, there's no comma. If you think like a computer scientist, you understand this is partially to save data on documents, not having additional punctuation. It also makes things a little bit faster. We're always moving towards making things clearer and faster. You can see that Faust has a slightly different way of being cited because it happens to be a poem that has line numbers. Dostoevsky, you see, reverts to the Cervantean method. Dostoevsky Notes from Underground is also a novel, more like a novella, a short novel, like Don Quixote. In general, you should just know that when you cite, you want to cite as specifically as you can. So most books that you read these days, particularly if they're translated or have an editor, they are differing editions from other translations, and they have differing page numbers from other translations. So the most important thing that you can include is the page number so that what you are citing can be found. When you cite a poem, however, an epic poem, for example, like Homer's Odyssey or Goethe's Faust or Dante's The Divine Comedy, they often have book numbers followed by line numbers, again, regardless of the translation. But regardless of the translation in this case, the line numbers and the book numbers will remain the same. So if you ever do have poetry with line numbers, you will be wanting to include the line numbers appended to the specific book or chapter that those lines happen to be in. You need the book or chapter because certain lines recur over and over and over again. So if you have a 24 chapter book, you can expect that lines 1 through 10 are going to recur 24 times. And so very important to get the book right when you get to Faust, for example. Though Faust doesn't have, it only has 2 parts, and so I wouldn't worry so much about it. Okay, 10 points are received for using appropriate professional language in your presentation and proofreading it to get rid of errors. In particular here, I'm not looking for you to write like Shakespeare, but I really do want you to proofread. Something that you should consider unacceptable in a college level paper, particularly in a literature class where the person grading you's skill set involves proofreading, is giving material that you have not proofread yourself. It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing. It's like going out to a dance without looking yourself over in the mirror first. Perhaps you have makeup on your teeth. Perhaps you have a hair sticking up in a funny alfalfa manner. You just don't look as put together as somebody that reviews themselves and makes the necessary adjustments to be as presentable as possible. If you are willing to do that with your physical body, even more so to do with your intellectual body of work, you must force yourself to look in the mirror of your work, to see it for what it is, so that you can improve it, which is the whole point. I'm a coach, I'm a fitness coach, I'm an athlete too. Something that I've often had to say both to myself and to clients is that you really need to take a good look at yourself. And you need to decide this. Well, here's a great quote for you. Oh, a dog that thinks it's already in the kennel will always sleep on the streets. Are you where you want to be? Or are you in a position to improve yourself so that you can get to where you want to be? Most people find themselves in the latter case, but they want to pretend as if they're in the former case. Do not pretend that you are yet Cervantes or a perfect writer. Do not pretend that perfect, excellent writers do not revise their work. Something that a contemporary writer of great fame and renown, Neil Gaiman, once said in San Diego when I saw him live after he'd come out with his retelling of the Norse god stories, was that he gets about the first 90% of his books done in the first draft. That sounds right to me. Yeah, you do a good job in your first draft. You create a lot, but it's the last 10% where he puts the magic in. That is also true. Writing is editing, and young people try to skip that part, and their writing is tremendously limited by it. You may see that in your own lives. How many times in your own life do you try to skip some step? The steps, perhaps, are what life are made of. Perhaps the journey is what your life is. If you skip a step, you're just skipping a meaningful part of your life. And so sometimes those are uncomfortable parts of your life, like when you read your own writing and you're like, oh, that's not as good as it should have been. But your second thought can be, I can improve this. Good thing I didn't misspell Don Quixote's name several times on here before Professor Schmid read this. That's something that's unacceptable, by the way. There are certain errors that destroy your credibility as a writer. Misspelling my name totally gets you. And people do that. Misspelling Cervantes' name. All you need to do is look at the book that you've been reading for like 30 hours. That's the expectation. To not get his name right, very, very embarrassing. Misspellings at all can be very embarrassing, especially with AI technology that is already appended to Word that helps you to spell and even use grammar correctly. These are AI tools that are already integrated into word processors, for example, and even into your text messaging. How many of you have autocorrect? It sometimes bugs you. That's AI, by the way. You know this. And so with all of these tools at your disposal, it is less and less and less and less acceptable to give something unfinished. It's 3 pages. I expect you to write. I expect you to edit. And when I detect that a work has not been edited, that puts you in a much lower grade category because you know that that is a major part of the assignment. So know that this is a short assignment so that you can edit it well, so that there are not mistakes. The professional standard, and this is for professionals, 1 error per page. That's still a lot of errors. My most recent article was 17 pages long. That'd be 17 errors of like not getting a contraction right, misspelling some word. What was I doing instead of editing that piece of work? And I would say, a couple errors get into my own work, sometimes embarrassing ones, and they do embarrass me. But usually very, 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 very few. So few that when one catches it, one's like, oh, is this really an error? Rather than, oh, look, another error. And so I really, really do want you to keep the analogy between formal attire and formal writing close to mind when you write. The same way that you would not go out with a mustard stain on your black lapel, you would not have a major gap in your own writing. You're expected to and perhaps you don't, but you're expected to think even more of your intellectual output, your writing, than even how you dress, particularly at college, where your dress is far less important than your thoughts. Okay, any questions on that or the philosophy behind that? Good. All right. Include in the following in your essay's format. Running head on every page. Running head is something that you're actually going to have to establish. I don't know if I have it on this particular document, but it is on the MLA document. It pops up. We do it on the top right. It will be your last name, space, followed by a page number. So you do that by integrating a page number. If I press enable editing here, you can sometimes just do that. And then you're over there. And then you want to be over here doing the header. One thing I'll tell you about the header is that if you're writing in Times New Roman, notice that Times New Roman is a serif-based font. Serifs are those little extra lines that you see on T's, F's, and I's. Make them look kind of nice. You see that? See this little thing? Serif wing. Arial has no serifs. You may know or not know this. This is the major difference between the two major fonts. How many of you like Arial? It's very plain. Some people like Arial a lot. People who are minimalists like it. How many of you like Times New Roman more? Yeah, you know, I like it, especially in the South, you know, we're Gothic. We like columns. We like things like that. It looks a little more regal, doesn't it? And I'll tell you that even though I don't allow Georgia, which is preloaded on here, is what a lot of newspapers use. It's very pleasant to the eye. Palatino linotype too. You wouldn't think I would know these sorts of things, but I read a lot of words. And so you come to know these sorts of things. All right, heading and title of the document. You need a title. Your name, which is your full first name, and followed by your last name, simple enough. Space under that, Mr. Schmidt or Professor Schmidt, whichever you want. Under that, CPLT/English 2202. And then under that, 25 September 2024. Include the date that the assignment is due, not when you are turning it in. Sometimes students have this old custom from when they were in high school to where they think if they put a date a day or two or three before the day due, they will look like they are a little bit more polished and professional, like they didn't work at the last moment. That's not how I judge your work. I think you've been working since the first day of class. Put the right date on there. You will get knocked if you don't end up doing it. So, and one thing I will say about the formatting is get the formatting right so that you do not have to think about it. That is the point of formatting. It is not made in order to antagonize you because of its technicality. It is made to answer questions that you might have. And so keep that in mind. And when you have formatting questions, particularly formatting questions prior to the day or two before the assignment is due, ask me. Feel free to ask me, email me, talk to me after class. I want to know that you're thinking about this. And a good way to show me that you're thinking about this, taking this seriously, and to put yourself on my radar, which is a good thing to do, because the more I see you and know that you're requesting help, the more I know that you're working. Otherwise, I assume, but I don't know. And well, it can just be to your advantage to let me know that you're working along the way, maybe in some very, very small way, but it may work. Include works cited page, indent appropriately, great. And I'm not going more into this than I could and showing you the actual MLA page because it would just take too long. But note that every single thing written here can save you points. And once you know it, it will help. All right, a little bit about how to write a paragraph. I have found that many students consider writing sort of like incanting a magical spell. What is one supposed to write in a formal paper? How does one write? One has heard from one's high school teachers and perhaps one's English 1000 composition professors that you need something like a thesis. You often need evidence. You probably need something like an introduction and a conclusion. You've heard of these things called body paragraphs, with this body metaphor being given to one's essay. And in fact, it's very like a body with a head, a body, and a conclusion, which is something like a tail. I guess maybe the legs in this case, but just a very general way to look at how to write a paragraph is something like this. And this looks a little bit like, this is actually kind of a mixture of an introductory paragraph and a body paragraph. So we can parse this out a little. Introduction. The introductory paragraph will include your thesis. Your thesis is what you wish to prove. There's no magic to a thesis. Tell me what you are going to prove. In this essay, Don Quixote will be proved not to be mad, but rather the sanest man in mad society. Something like that. It is something that you are claiming that you have some evidence that you think can substantiate that idea. It is an art developing a really good thesis, picking out excellent evidence and arguing appropriately for this. There's no way to make this a pure science. There is an art to it, and it takes a lot of practice. And so, again, don't expect to do this to even your own satisfaction the first time you do it. But do know that once you have something on the page, you can judge it. When you can judge it, you can improve it. Particularly if you, unlike Don Quixote, look at what you have produced with clear eyes rather than diluted eyes. But remember that a thesis, thesis is a nice Greek transliterated word, from the Greek word typhemi, which means to place. One of those nice Greek me verbs, to place. So this is what's placed on top of your essay. And this is that from which everything comes. It's the source of your essay. It is the most important part. And it is the mother of your essay. And perhaps also the father. It is the progenitor of it. And so without a thesis, without a good thesis, without you knowing your thesis and consciously arguing for it throughout the entirety of the essay, there's no way that your essay will be good or effective. You must have a clear essay, you must, or thesis, and you must have the ability to support it to some extent or another. All right, hope for analysis. So in your body paragraphs, each one of your body paragraphs will itself have an introductory statement that says, this is what this paragraph is going to do. Purpose of paragraph. And usually the purpose of the paragraph is proving some part of your thesis. Perhaps you have a three-part thesis. If you have a three-part thesis, I intend to prove that Don Quixote is not mad because of the actions of Cardenio, because of the actions of Sancho, because of the actions of this person or that. It is very general. So yeah, I expect you to do better. Then each body paragraph you have will seek to prove one part of your thesis. And so again, when you start your body paragraphs, you tell me what the purpose is. You give a very clear what's called topic sentence. And then you may set up a helpful quote. Quote the helpful quote. Explain the helpful quote. And then transition. If you have these parts in a paragraph, in your body paragraphs, this will help to make your writing better. Like a car, unlike an imaginary thing, like we're imagining writing. Like a car, each part of an essay should have a function. In fact, you may know, which organ of your body have people traditionally, at least for the past 100 years or so, thought was vestigial and no longer had a function in your body. Maybe some of you have already lost it. The appendix, yes. Did you know in the last 15 years that they found a use of the appendix? Yeah, it supposedly helps with your gut biomes, helps you digest a little. So was it in fact just vestigial? Or did this thing in your body still have a use? It does seem to have a use, a minor use, and you can live without it, sure. But it wasn't just still there. Same thing with your writing. There's no appendix in your writing. There should be no extra sentences. There should be no what I call like flabby writing. It should be muscular and tense. What do I mean by that? Well, looking at the body analogy, there should be nothing extra. Everything should help you. Everything is coming from you and is being included in this thing in order to prove the point that you are making. And so, if you will read back through, and I can tell you, having written a lot, I've gotten to the point now where I have to get rid of pages, paragraphs, sentences, and at some point when paring things down, you're not just paring down what's useless or doesn't help, you're paring down really interesting, smart, intelligent sentences that you, and paragraphs and points that you want to keep You may not have the space to. You are starting to make very good decisions and know that you are writing a very good piece when you have to get rid of sentences and it hurts. This was a good sentence. This is a good paragraph. This is a good point, but it's not as good or useful as the other ones. And I'll tell you just a small philosophical point here is this. It's very easy to make decisions between good and evil or good and bad. The hardest decisions you will make in your life are between good and good, bad and bad. And you will have to decipher what is better and what is worse in these situations. Like if you get into two colleges that are very good, where do you go? That's a much harder decision than if, say, you only get into one. Or if, it's college or a much worse option for you. But when it's between two things of seemingly equivalent value, well, you don't want to end up like the proverbial cow, right? Have you heard of the proverbial cow? Proverbial cow, you put a cow equidistance between two haystacks, what happens to the cow? It starves, right? Do you understand? Because it lacks the discernment necessary to make the decision between two equivalent things. And so it makes no decision. Well, you don't want to be like this. Okay, cool. Coherent body paragraphs. Coherent body paragraphs support the thesis. They harmonize with each other and they progressively lead to one's conclusion. You're writing very well when you take a look at your 3 or 4 body paragraphs and you really think, are these ordered correct? Are these like a musical progression? Are these reaching higher and higher crescendos? Or do I lose steam? Well, that can happen. Or are they very balanced? That's good too. But I would say the crescendo has the greatest rhetorical impact. Put your weakest point first. Put your second weakest second. Put your strongest third. Why put your strongest third? A, it shows good rhetorical writing. You know what your strongest point is. B, you put it close to the end. Well, there's some sort of folk psychology, which is apparently real psychology, included in the philosophy of essay writing, which is this. The first thing that somebody reads that you wrote, and the last thing are the things that stick in their head. It's the same thing when you speak. This is why a good class. If are any of you trying to be teachers, taking pedagogy classes? Okay, well, if you're ever running any sort of meeting, people will teach you this sort of thing too. You say the most important things first, try and reiterate them several times, and then you say them last as well, so they stick in people's minds. Well, you have an introduction and you have a conclusion, 2 separate paragraphs in this. In the introduction, you tell me what you will prove. You put things in the future or the future perfect. This will have been proven. It's a very literary tense to have the future perfect. It's the past of the future. This will have happened. Just like the past perfect is the past of the past. This had happened. And rather than this has happened. It had to happen before it would have happened. And it certainly had to happen before it will have happened. That's very funny. If you really love language, you probably really enjoy those sentences. In any case, in your conclusion, you tell me what did happen. What did you prove? But sometimes students then have a moment of crisis. While you're telling me what you did prove, what might flow through your mind? Think about it. Think about essays you've written going through this process. At the end. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Something you didn't say.
Maybe I didn't prove it. Is this a very good proof? I don't feel like I proved it. It's like, well, that's one of those tough moments, right? Hopefully it's not an hour before it's due. Because when you have that moment, you have to go back in. You haven't fixed the engine. The car's not ready to go. You need to go back and fix the problem. Your own instincts, your own judgment are what you have to go on when you're writing these essays. It is difficult. I'm not there with you saying, if I sat right next to you and we talked about every single sentence that you were going to write, which is the thing that does happen, by the way. That is, like learning how to play the violin or having somebody correct you, teaching you how to bounce a basketball. That is a very effective way to learn. Unfortunately, we don't, and perhaps fortunately to you, that does not occur. And so it's your responsibility to keep these lessons in mind and to use what you know The most important thing in college is not that you know everything, but that you be willing, like a professional, to use your knowledge. That you overcome whatever native sort of desire to move on to the next thing is eating at you. And I know it's getting at you hard. You have so many fun things that you could be doing, but you must focus on this and you must do it right. And this, again, my claim is that this is what is most important to your experience here in college, not just what's happening in this classroom, but the classroom assignments and the classroom activities that you have in all of your classrooms. Yes, these are the least pleasant things that you do. These are the things that help you to transform into what you become. Okay, D, a strong conclusion reiterates. The thesis has been proved. Tell me it's been proved. Tell me how it was proved. And tell me this is something that almost every student always misses, which is perhaps the most important part of your conclusion because it tells me what the purpose of your writing was. And you're going to feel a little bit like a fraud when you write this because you're like, I'm not a scholar. What do I know? And yet you are expected to act as a scholar here. Tell me the importance or the broader implications of your proof. What can I study based on what you have studied? Based on what you've studied, what interesting thing do I now know that is of importance to me? The most important criterion for writing something is that it have some purpose, that have some meaning, that it have some value for somebody else. You're communicating with somebody. And so I think this is the hardest criterion for young readers, young writers to fulfill. What is the purpose behind what I wrote? Because you're like, well, the purpose is that you made me write something. I'm like, yes, I did. You are expected to come up with something that is meaningful. And so that generation, that creative act is part of your own skill, your own art, and something that is expected from you, something that I cannot just convey to you through a rubric. You all know that moment in a math equation where all of a sudden you have to do some thinking. You can't just follow the steps. You have to actually calculate. And that's when the steps fall off and it comes down to you. You have the same moment when it comes down to writing, as you all know from having had to write in the past. Okay. Common errors. Again, because we just don't have that much time ever. Know that these are errors that get people all the time, so really do review them. Getting the heading wrong, wrong date, wrong name. Sometimes people put my name instead of their name. You know, use your head, but also contact me if something seems weird. Spacing between paragraphs, oftentimes between the heading and the title, or the title and the body paragraphs, or the body paragraphs and the works cited, students like to include extra spaces. Just the one double space, not two double spaces. It looks bad and it's also incorrect. Undescriptive titles. Give a title to your work. Make it descriptive. I need to know a little bit about what you're writing based on your title. Saying Don Quixote essay, that is pathetic. That is weak. That is unthoughtful. That is thoughtless. You want to be thoughtful in your writing, particularly your writing. If not in your gift giving and your everyday living, at least in your writing. Thoughtless titles are evidence of thoughtless writing. Know that every little thing you put in your writing, like every action you have when you're living, is evidence of something more. We don't see things just one at a time. We see associated. We associate things together. In fact, Russell Kirk says it's the most natural way of thinking is to connect things together. It's actually much harder to analyze and to parse things apart. I think you probably have found that. When you're having a really great conversation with somebody, you're making connections. But a lot harder is okay, what are the differences actually between these things? In any case, have a good title. A really clever pun is sometimes really strong, but if it's not a very good pun, that's not as strong. So titles can be puns, they can be clever, they should be at the very least descriptive, ideally interesting. So like my most recent article was something like, I had some powerful words. It was contrapasso, Italian, people are like, what's that? But then I said violence and madness. Violence and madness are concepts that most people are interested in to some extent. Okay, make sure that you have your in-text citations. Make sure that you have your works cited page with its final citations and you get the indenting right. Make sure also that when you write, you don't include too much summary. This is, if you look at your basic paragraph here, you note that there is no step that says, tell me what happened in the story. You might have a tiny bit of that in your setup of helpful quote and your explanation of helpful quotes. But don't retell the story. Cervantes already told it. I, as your reader, am an ideal audience for your reading in that I know what happened in the text. So you need very, very little explanation of it. And in fact, it doesn't make you look smarter or like a more mature writer. It makes you look like a less mature writer who doesn't have the most important things to say. Summarizing, that's something that AI can do, Wikipedia can do. What you need to do is analyze. And that's what I expect you to do. There are lots of okay summaries on the internet. We don't need another one. Use strong topic sentences which state the purpose of the paragraph. That's strong language right there. Use strong language. Use as few adverbs as possible, perhaps as few adjectives. Use verbs. This is a strong sentence right here. Use strong topic sentences which state the purpose of the paragraph. That would be a good topic sentence itself. It lets you know exactly what it means. Again, another thing about writing is you don't need to, it's not arcane wizardry. You don't need to use the fanciest words you've ever heard, the fanciest expressions you've ever seen. You don't need to make it seem overly elegant, just needs to be good. And so that means that you need to hit what is most important in the assignment. And so you shouldn't have time to try and come up with $10 words. You shouldn't have space in your essay to make meaningless but beautiful statements. If you would ever even be interested in doing such. All right, and then the last thing that I have to say here is choose quotes which support your position as evidence. Just including a quote is by no means the art of the assignment. Choosing evidence that supports your point is part of the art of the assignment. Sometimes you can find a quote that with very, very limited explanation really, really affirms your point. And sometimes you'll find a quote that if you really argue for it well, put the effort in, rather than rely on me to understand it, then it can be a useful piece of evidence. And then sometimes a piece of evidence doesn't really say what you need it to say, and you need to, drop it and find another one. Again, that's a painful moment. It takes more time than you would like it to, but when you are in that moment, get rid of it, find something better, know that that's part of the process. You only need to find a few quotes for the whole assignment anyway. So I don't expect that this is going to take too much time, though it will take some. The prompts. Okay, I read one once. So let me start with two. Using David Damrosch's article, What is World Literature? And there's the JSTOR link, so you can click on that and get it. 1, summarize his position on what a classic masterpiece and piece of world literature is. So make sure that you include all of these. 2, critique and attempt to improve on Damrosch's definition of masterpiece. And 3, apply the definition to one of the works that we have considered this year, Don Quixote in this case. Okay. Compare David Damrosch's definition of masterpiece to at least one other scholarly definition. All right, so one thing that I do in my questions is that I set out subparts of the question. The reason that I do this is that if I have a 1, 2, 3, this makes it very easy for you to know how to organize your essay, because you know that there are 3 parts of the question that you need to answer. So you'll have an introduction where you describe what you're intending to answer, which is in the prompt that I've already given you. And then you'll have at least 3 paragraphs where you address 1, 2, and 3, as well as a conclusion. Now, does it have to be that? No, but that is the simplest, most straightforward way to address this. So you already have an outline for your essay if you have read these questions appropriately. And so if this were a 4,000 level class, I'll give you a 1-sentence prompt. If I even gave you a prompt, I would say something like, write about Don Quixote for 10 pages, or I might say, analyze magic in Don Quixote, and then integrate these philosophical systems into it. Realism, perspectivism, maybe cosmopolitanism, colonialism, or something like that. we are at the 2000 level right now, and so you get a little bit more scaffolding. Now, that said, if you think you are better than the prompts and you want to take an additional challenge on, and you've got a nice idea, run it by me. I'll approve. I'm happy to approve different ideas. Again, I told you that I had my student last semester who was a big fan of Marcella and Grisostomo, and really wanted to write about them. There was not a prompt about them, and so he approached me. He sent me a proposal, and I approved it. So you are welcome to do more if you would like to, but you are not required to. All right, 3. Consider a conventional theme, which Cervantes subverts in his Don Quixote. We're going to be talking a ton about subversions, particularly on Wednesday, prior to our Friday seminar, when we have a lot of time to talk about Grisostomo, Marcella, and Cardenio, Lucinda, Don Fernando, and Dorotea. Princess Micomicona, as she's going by, and the current. But consider a conventional theme which Cervantes subverts in Don Quixote. Religion, remember Cid Hamete, Benengeli. Gender, Marcella Grisostomo, Lucinda, Dorotea, lots of dressing up as different genders in this first part of Don Quixote. Or class, a lot of talk about class and what peasants versus noblemen are allowed to do, who's allowed to fight whom. Apparently chivalric knights can only fight against other knights, and they shouldn't trust peasants, or at least according to Don Quixote's deluded way of seeing things. We will see a lot more about class, I would say, because we will have a couple upper class figures who are actual upper class figures, like we will see an actual duke, an actual fictional duke, and the second part, for example, and also another nobleman in Barcelona. But if you are already getting a beat on such a notion, follow. All right. Give an example from another piece of literature. And this doesn't have to be from a piece of literature in this class, because we've only read one. What you consider a normal representation of the theme. And then explain what makes Cervantes' representation a subversion. That means, so like perversion or conversion. Verse means to turn. So like, when we talk about a line of verse, so poetry, we don't talk about lines, we talk about verses because they turn at the end. And so to subvert is to twist something, is to contaminate it, to change it from what it was meant to be into something else. It's similar to a conversion, and similar to a perversion too, but somewhere in between both of these. Okay. And then include, let's see, B. Okay, so explain what makes it a subversion, and B, distinct. What makes it different? Include at least 2 primary sources in your investigation, Don Quixote and whatever text you take the normal representation from. So just the 2 texts. 4. Does a work of literature having 2 parts help or hinder it from being a masterpiece? Does having 2 parts make a work of literature more or less a work of modernism? Use at least one scholarly secondary source to define modernism, one to define a masterpiece. You are welcome to use sources different from Damrosch 11, though those will help you quite a bit. This is a question that you're going to see pop up on other essays too. Something that you will notice is that in the first 3 books that we read for this class, each of them is split into 2 parts. Don Quixote, split into 2 parts, written 10 years apart from each other. Goethe's Faust, written in 2 parts, 50 years separates the 2, and then Notes from Underground split into 2 parts, though it's a very short work, no time splits. So you may very well become interested in the convention of splitting a book into 2. I mean, something you may wonder is like, when do you start a new chapter? When do you start a new part of a book? Especially when you're creating it all. Interesting. In any case, 5. Compare 3 times in Don Quixote that magic and delusion are combined. How this reflects modernism in the world. I'd say this is probably the strongest prompt. There's the least there, but there's the most in the text to answer this. And you will have already started to notice that there is a strong relationship between imagination, line, and enchantment / magic in this text. It is very much unclear what the function of magic is, because it seems like sometimes Don Quixote sees a giant, whereas Sancho sees a windmill, and Don Quixote claims, well, he must have seen a giant because enchanters follow him around and enchant his vision. So even if somebody next to him sees something that is real and claims that Don Quixote is out of his mind, he does not trust what those near him say, because they are not afflicted by the enchantment of the evil enchanters that follow. And so something very interesting for you to consider for yourself. And just so that you have one of those $10 words that is perhaps useful when thinking about the relationship between magic and trickery. Do any of you know what prestidigitation means? What about sleight of hand? What does sleight of hand mean? It's a con. Right. Prestidigitation, sleight of hand would be like 3-card Monty. You all know this game. You have 3 cards. There's like a coin or a mark under one, and I do, okay, we're gonna move these cards here and here and here and here, and then you're like, it's definitely there. Boom, it's not there. It's a con. Sleight of hand, trick you. It's a trick. There's a difference between, in our minds, what true magic and a trick, right? Well, something that you'll be thinking about if you think about 5 is there a difference between true magic and a trick? Something I'll give you because it's interesting. Look. Any of you really interested in languages look at suffixes and prefixes ever to understand the true root of a word and where it came from? You look at imagination, you look at image, when you look right in the middle of that. Imagination shares a root with which word? Magic. That's right. That might be something you really want to think about. That might be something you really want to think about. Is the only true magic from the imagination? In any case, that's the sort of thought I want you thinking about while you write this essay, particularly if you're writing on number 5, because that is a tough question to answer. And something that I'll say about any of these questions is I don't have a side that I'm a big fan of. My side is good argumentation. So you can argue A about the text or Z. A great text like this admits of many interpretations. And so what I want from you is the best interpretation possible. And so it doesn't matter to me which position you end up taking. So again, like this journey metaphor that we're continuing with throughout this class, it's how you get there that I really care about. It's not where you start or where you get to. It's the journey there. I mean, it's all a part. As you will have noticed with this particular narrative, which is episodic, right? So there are these things that happen that are self-contained, but running through it is a consistent narrative. It's a little bit like pi. If you've ever seen representations of pi being irrational, it makes sort of semicircles over and over and over again, not semicircles, but circles that occupy different space until it ends up making a very lucid and beautiful sphere. So sometimes the thing that comes from something, sometimes the whole is greater than the part. And that's all I have to say about that. Okay, since I only have time to do the second part of what I wanted to do today, but it is mostly in line with what we were just talking about, I want to go over this long definition, because I think that you'll find that this long definition helps you to square your thoughts on modernism. And hopefully, while I'm reading this to you, and you will have many opportunities to read this yourself because it's on Moodle, you will have ideas and episodes and moments from Don Quixote start to pop into your head. That seems pretty modern to me. Or maybe you'll come talk to me afterwards and say, is this modernist? And I'll say, well, it depends on if you argue or not, but it sounds sort of modernist to me. In any case, this is from Ulysses in the Age of Modernism. Notice that Ulysses, of course, is one of the texts that we will be reading in this class. In fact, one of the things I was looking forward to talking about today, just a funny thing to talk about, a little bit gross, was that a claim made in Ulysses is that the first protagonist in literature to defecate, to use the bathroom, to take a number 2 in literature. Not true at all. as you all know, because you've seen Sancho do the very same, right next to Don Quixote. And Don Quixote is like, what is that smell? You must be very scared. And Sancho says, yes, yes, I am. And he makes noise, and it's gross, but it's and very much in line with these individuals because it's very funny. But it is also one of the first times, if not the first time, that such a gross bodily act is actually included in literature, which is part of the realism and the modernism of the text. In any case, I read. First, modernist literature is distinguished by its formalism. This means how it structures itself. It insists on the importance of structure and design. Parts. Thinking about parts 1 and 2. Thinking about the episodic structure. The aesthetic autonomy, that means the independence of its art. Aesthesis is a Greek word that means sensation. And aesthetics is the study of art that we have nowadays. The aesthetic autonomy and independent whatness of the work of art, almost to that degree summarized by the famous dictum saying that, quote, a poem should not mean but be. It's an interesting quote. You might really want to know. Poem should not mean but be. What could that possibly mean? Secondly, modernism is characterized by an attitude of detachment and non-commitment. What if the author made constant errors and mistakes? That show a detached attitude or non-committal attitude, which I would put under the general heading of irony, in the sense that the term of that term as used by the new critics. Don't worry about getting into that so much. Who the new critics are and what they have to say. You can, but unnecessary. Third, modernist literature makes use of myth, not in the way myth was used earlier, which is all next, as a discipline for belief or a subject for interpretation, but as an arbitrary means of ordering art. Remember that arbitrary means non-universal. If I make an arbitrary decision, I have just made a decision ad hoc, out of nowhere, not according to reason, not in line with any notions of consistency. In fact, arbitration, as opposed to mediation in the American legal system, is when one goes to a third party and the third party person gives a binding decision. So, like you might arbitrate a divorce, for example, or something like that. But when the arbiter makes their arbitrary decision, that decision becomes real and legally binding, unlike a mediator, for example. A mediator doesn't have binding. Just a little bit about what being truly arbitrary is. Okay, and finally, I would date the age of modernism from the time of the Impressionists. Picasso is, for part of his career, one of those, though there are many, Van Gogh, many Dutch artists are Impressionists. They use color and an interesting perspective. It's as if they're on opium, right? Like they're on drugs, seeing things for their essences rather than the descriptive values. I would date the age of modernism from the time of the Impressionists because I think there is a clear line of development from Impressionism to reflexivism. Modernist art turns back upon itself. It's reflective, it's self-reflective. It looks at itself like you are expected to look at your writing, and is largely concerned with its own creation and composition. This should start to sound a lot like something you are reading. The Impressionist insistence that the viewer is more important than the subject viewed leads ultimately to solipsistic worlds within worlds of modernist art and literature. Do you all know what solipsism is? It comes from sole, solus in Latin, only, alone. Do you know what narcissism is? Have any of you ever been called a narcissist? No, I'm just kidding, or called somebody a narcissist, or know the story of Narcissus? You know the story of Narcissus is a guy who's so pretty. Here's my wonderful art. He looked into a pool, he saw himself, and then he jumped into the pool to save himself because he's so beautiful and died. Or was so narcissistic that he looked at himself until he died of starvation. Isn't that narcissistic? Solipsistic? Even worse. Solipsistic person, any of you ever seen The Matrix? It doesn't matter. Solipsistic person thinks that only they exist in all the universe. That everything you see outside of you is just a part of your vision of the universe, and it would disappear if you disappear.
I've heard that too. Like whatever you're not looking at behind you isn't really there.
It's not.
Spawns it.
It's
Turn around.
It's not. It's not for you. Well, you know, and you get this in old Buddhist cones too. Like if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's around to hear it, then it really fall.
Like that's something they should all kids have. That's something you grow out of.
That's something you grow out of. I think is a fantastic thing to say. Maybe I'll edit that a little. That's something one hopes one
You grow out.
Okay, in any case, modernist literature is often solipsistic. Perhaps you have a protagonist who is, to some extent, solipsistic. All right, we talked about what we needed to talk about today. New definition of modernism, talked about our prompts. Wednesday, we have a lot of text to talk about and some funny things that Sancho and Don Quixote have done, like usual. Class, as usual.